They sold me to the silent Alpha, the man who hasn't spoken in a decade. Everyone in my old pack whispered that Alpha Thane was a monster, a beast who communicated only through violence and terror. My father traded me to him to clear a massive gambling debt, tossing me to the wolf quite literally. I expected chains. I expected a cold, damp cell with rats for roommates. Instead, I was shoved into a mahogany-paneled penthouse suite that cost more than my entire life's earnings. But I'm not the kind of girl who cries in a corner waiting for a savior. If I'm going to be a prisoner, I'm going to be the most expensive, annoying, bratty prisoner this silent jerk has ever met. I was just about to throw a vase at the wall to test the acoustics when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The air suddenly got heavy, thick with the scent of rain and raw power. I wasn't alone. Welcome back to Eliana's Romance Library, your home for alphas, obsession, and happy endings. Before we dive into today's story, I want to hear from you. I love seeing how global our community is becoming, so head down to the comments right now and let me know. Where in the world are you listening from today? Ready? Let's get into the story. Chapter 1. The Golden Cage. If this is a dungeon, I'm going to leave a very confusing Yelp review. I said it loud enough for the guards outside to hear, but the heavy oak door had already clicked shut with a terrifying finality. The sound echoed in the massive room, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and the ridiculous crystal chandelier that hung overhead like a guillotine made of diamonds. I dropped my singular duffel bag onto the floor. It looked pathetic against the hand-woven Persian rug. My father had given me 10 minutes to pack before the Mountain Ridge black SUVs rolled up to collect his debt. 10 minutes. I had prioritized toothpaste and my favorite leather jacket over sentimentality. I didn't pack a single photo of him. Let him rot in his debt-free house while his daughter played chew toy for the bogeyman. I kicked off my boots, aiming for a delicate-looking side table. I missed, but the intent was there. Okay, Elara, assess, adapt, annoy, I muttered to myself, marching deeper into the suite. This wasn't a cell. It was a master suite in a brooding Gothic mansion that smelled like old money and lemon polish. There was a king-sized bed with sheets that probably had a higher thread count than my IQ, a fireplace large enough to roast a whole deer, and a balcony that looked out over a forest so dense it seemed to swallow the light. I walked to the balcony doors and rattled the handle. Locked, of course. Classic, I scoffed, turning back to the room. I paced toward the fireplace, running my hand along the mantel. So, the silent Alpha buys a wife, consort, and locks her in a tower. How original. Does he think I'm Rapunzel? Because if he climbs up my hair, I'm kicking him in the face. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. I popped the stopper, sniffed it, expensive whiskey, and considered pouring it onto the rug just to see what would happen. I hope you have stain remover, I shouted at the ceiling, assuming there were cameras. Because I am not housebroken. Silence. Just the crackle of the fire. It was infuriating. I had spent the entire 3-hour drive preparing for a fight. I had practiced my scathing insults. I had visualized kneeing a guard in the groin. I was ready to go down swinging, screaming, and biting. But you can't fight luxury. You can't knee a duvet cover in the groin. I wandered over to a painting hanging above the desk. It was a moody, abstract swirl of blacks and dark blues. Depressing, I critiqued loudly. It looks like a bruised ego. Is this a self-portrait, Alpha? Is that why you don't talk? Cat got your tongue, or did you just swallow it out of boredom? I spun around, looking for something else to mock. My eyes landed on the massive walk-in closet door. I marched over, ready to raid it for something I could tie into a rope, but stopped dead in my tracks. The air in the room had changed. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was instant. The oxygen seemed to vanish, replaced by a pressure that made my lungs burn. A scent hit me. Ozone, wet earth, and something dark and spicy, like burnt cedar. It was a smell that triggered every instinct I had to run, hide, and submit. But I didn't run. I froze. I slowly turned back toward the entrance of the room. I had assumed the click of the lock was the guards leaving. I had assumed I was alone in my golden cage. I had been shouting insults at the furniture, threatening the upholstery, and critiquing the art. I was wrong. Standing in the corner of the room, completely still and blending into the shadows, he was massive. That was the first thing my brain registered. He took up space in a way that felt unfair to the laws of physics. Shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, arms crossed over a chest that strained the fabric of a black t-shirt. He was leaning against the wall, perfectly relaxed, watching me with eyes that glowed with a faint predatory luminescence. Alpha Thane, the Silent King. And he had heard every single word. Chapter 2. The first word. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced myself to stand my ground. I wasn't going to let him see me sweat. If he wanted to lurk in the shadows like a gargoyle in a designer t-shirt, that was his problem, not mine. Enjoying the show? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I charge extra for the commentary. He didn't blink. He just peeled himself off the wall. The movement was fluid, terrifyingly graceful for a man the size of a vending machine. He stepped into the light of the chandelier and my breath hitched. The stories hadn't done him justice. They said he was scary. They didn't mention he was devastatingly handsome in a rugged, I could crush you with one hand kind of way. Dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and a scar running through his left eyebrow that gave him a permanent look of dangerous intrigue. He didn't speak. He just walked toward me. Slow. Deliberate. Like a predator who knew the prey had nowhere to go. Stop, I ordered, holding up a hand. He didn't stop. I said stop. I took a step back, hitting the edge of the desk behind me. What is wrong with you? Do you not speak English, or are you just too high and mighty to talk to the merchandise? He stopped then, just a foot away. He was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. He towered over me, his shadow swallowing mine. His scent, rain and cedar, was overwhelming now, filling my nose, making my wolf pace anxiously in my chest. She didn't want to fight him. She wanted to roll over and bare her throat. Traitor. My father owes you money, I snapped, desperate to break the suffocating silence. That's why I'm here. I'm collateral. I get it. But I am not a lamp you can just stare at. I'm a person. So use your words, big guy. Tell me the rules so I can figure out how to break them. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was the look you'd give a particularly noisy chihuahua. That did it. The fear evaporated, replaced by the white-hot flash of indignation. I reached out and poked him. Hard. Right in the center of his rock-solid chest. Don't look at me like that, I hissed. I am not scared of you. You think because you're the big, bad, silent alpha, everyone has to bow down? I don't bow. And I definitely don't shut up. I went to poke him again, but I never made contact. His hand shot up, a blur of motion, and wrapped around my wrist. His grip was iron, unyielding, but shockingly gentle. Before I could gasp, he stepped forward, crowding into my personal space until my thighs bumped against his. He walked me backward until my spine hit the wall next to the fireplace. Let go, I whispered, though the protest lacked any real heat. My pulse was thumping in my throat, right where his eyes were focused. He didn't let go. He pinned my wrist to the wall above my head. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my lips, hot, ragged, and smelling of mint. His eyes weren't just glowing now. They were burning with a golden intensity that felt like it was stripping my soul bare. He looked at my mouth, then my eyes. The silence stretched, tight as a violin string about to snap. I waited for a growl, a threat, a command to submit. Instead, his chest expanded with a deep, shuddering inhale. His lips parted. The sound that came out was rusty, deep, and vibrated straight through my bones, shattering 10 years of silence in a single syllable. Mine. Chapter 3. Touch starved. The word hung in the air, heavier than the humidity before a storm. Mine. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a fact. I didn't remember falling asleep. I just remembered the way the air had left the room when he spoke, the way my knees had turned to jelly, and the way he had scooped me up before I could hit the floor. Now, I was waking up in a furnace. I blinked one eye open, disoriented. The room was dark, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. I was warm. Too warm. And I couldn't move. A heavy arm was draped over my waist, effectively pinning me to the mattress. A massive leg was hooked over mine, tangling our limbs together in a knot of possessive heat. I was the little spoon in a very large, very muscular cutlery drawer. I froze. Alpha Silas, the silent killer, the man who had terrified 3 counties into submission, was cuddling? I tried to inch away, moving my hips just a fraction to the left to create some space. A low, rumbling growl vibrated directly against my back. The arm around my waist tightened instantly, pulling me flush against him until there wasn't even room for air between us. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply, his nose cold against my skin. "Okay," I whispered to the darkness. "So we're doing this. Great." He wasn't just sleeping. He was clinging. It was the grip of a man who was starving, touch-starved. It made sense, I realized with a jolt of pity I quickly squashed. If he hadn't spoken in 10 years, he probably hadn't let anyone get close enough to touch him either. He was treating me like a stress ball he finally found after a decade of anxiety. "Silas," I tried, wiggling my shoulder. "I need to pee." He grunted. It sounded like a refusal. "That wasn't a request," I insisted, pushing against his arm. "Unless you want me to ruin these very expensive sheets, let me up." He went still. Then, slowly, reluctantly, the iron bands around me loosened. I scrambled out of the bed, gasping as the cool air hit my skin. I was still fully clothed, jeans and all, which made the intimacy of the cuddling even weirder. When I came back from the bathroom, the lights were on. Silas was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was shirtless now, and sweet mother of goddess, that was a lot of skin. Scars crisscrossed his torso, silver lines mapping out a history of violence I didn't know, but the muscles underneath rippled with impatient energy. He looked at me, and the vulnerability of the sleeping cuddle was gone. The silent Alpha was back. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes tracking me as I walked toward my duffel bag. "I need a shower," I announced, grabbing a towel. "And since I didn't pack for a slumber party with a giant, I'm borrowing a shirt." I waited for him to nod or point or leave. He stood up. "I can shower by myself, thanks," I said, backing up a step. He ignored me. He crossed the room in 2 strides. Before I could dodge, he bent down and swept me up into his arms, bridal style. I actually squeaked, and grabbed his shoulders for balance. "Put me down!" I slapped his bare shoulder. It was like slapping a boulder. "I have legs! They work!" He didn't look at me. He just walked straight into the massive ensuite bathroom. He kicked the door shut behind us and set me down on the marble counter next to the sink, trapping me between his arms. He reached over and turned on the tap, testing the water temperature with a focus that was terrifyingly domestic. He wasn't trying to have sex with me. He was taking care of me? No, that wasn't it. He was handling me, like I was something precious he had just acquired and needed to polish. He dipped a washcloth in the warm water and turned to me. His eyes were dark, dilated, and completely focused on my face. He raised the cloth to my cheek. "I can wash my own face," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. He paused. He looked deep into my eyes, and for a second, I thought he might speak again. I thought he might tell me to be quiet, or tell me I was beautiful, or tell me to get out. But he didn't. He just shook his head once. "No." And gently, possessively, began to wipe a smudge of dirt from my chin. his touch claiming me more effectively than any words ever could. Chapter 4. The Clothing Thief. Standing on the counter while a 6'5" killing machine washed my face with the tenderness of a grandmother polishing her fine china was, frankly, confusing. When he finished, he patted my skin dry, inspected his handiwork with a critical eye, and then set me down on the bath mat. "Great, I'm clean," I said, my voice sounding a little too breathy for my liking. "Now, unless you want me walking around in these 3-day-old jeans, I need clothes." Thane pointed to a small pile of fabric on the vanity that I hadn't noticed. It was a dress, a silk, flimsy, impractical thing that looked like it belonged on a doll, not a woman who might need to jump a fence at any moment. I picked it up with 2 fingers. "Absolutely not. I don't do submissive housewife chic." I dropped the dress and marched past him, straight into the cavernous walk-in closet. It smelled like him, cedar, spice, and cold air. I ignored the rows of pristine suits and went for the drawers. I pulled out a black button-down shirt that looked soft enough to sleep in and big enough to live in. I stripped off my shirt without looking at him, asserting dominance or just being reckless, I wasn't sure, and pulled his shirt on. It swallowed me whole. The hem hit my mid-thigh and the sleeves hung past my hands. I rolled them up, buttoned it halfway, and turned around. Thane was leaning in the doorway. His eyes were dilated so wide they were almost entirely black. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent. Me wrapped in his clothes. It was a territorial claim, and I had just walked right into it. "Hungry," I stated, breaking the intense stare-down. "Feed me." 10 minutes later, I was sitting at a dining table long enough to host a summit meeting. A terrified-looking beta placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of me, then scurried away as if I were a bomb about to detonate. Thane stood by the window, coffee in hand, staring out at his territory, his back to me. I looked at the food, then at his broad back. "I'm not eating alone," I announced. He didn't turn. "I mean it, Thane. I spent the last 3 days in a car. I'm not eating in silence while you brood over the lawn maintenance. Sit." He turned his head slightly, giving me that side eye that usually made grown men weep. I folded my arms and leaned back. "I can wait. I have a very slow metabolism." For a full minute, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. It was a battle of wills. He was the immovable object, and I was the unstoppable annoyance. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like a tire deflating, he walked over. He didn't take the chair at the head of the table. He pulled out the chair directly next to mine, dragging it loudly across the floor until it was flush against mine. He sat down, his thigh pressing firmly against mine. The heat radiating off him was distracting. He pointed at my fork. "Eat." "You first," I challenged, testing my luck. His jaw tightened. He took the fork from my hand. He stabbed a piece of bacon, but instead of eating it himself, he brought it to my lips. His eyes locked onto mine, daring me to look away. He was flipping the script. I wanted him to join me. He was making me submit to his care. My heart raced. I opened my mouth and he fed me, his thumb brushing my bottom lip. The intimacy of it, the metal fork, his rough skin, the intense focus, hit me lower in my stomach than bacon should. Chapter 5. The Whisper. By nightfall, the sky had turned a bruised purple, and the wind was howling around the manor like a pack of rejected wolves. I hated storms. In my old pack, storms meant the basement, leakage, and cold. I was curled up on the massive velvet sofa in the library, trying to read a book I hadn't turned the page of in 20 minutes. Every time thunder cracked, I flinched. I tried to hide it, burying my nose deeper in the book. But you can't hide a heartbeat from a wolf. Thane was sitting in a leather armchair across from me, working on a tablet. He hadn't looked up in an hour, or so I thought. Crack boom. The house shook. I jumped, dropping the book. Before the book hit the floor, Thane was there. He didn't walk. He blurred. 1 second, he was in the chair. The next, he was squeezing onto the sofa beside me, pulling me into his lap. I'm fine. I lied, my voice shaking. It's just atmospheric pressure. He ignored my lie. He tucked my head under his chin, wrapping his arms around me like a human shield. His body was a fortress. The thunder rumbled again, but with his chest vibrating against my ear, the sound was muffled, distant. He smelled of safety. He started to groom me. It was instinct, pure and simple. His large hand moved to my hair, his fingers untangling the knots with methodical, rhythmic strokes. It was something mother wolves did to pups, or mates did to each other to soothe anxiety. It was mesmerizing. I felt my muscles melting, the tension bleeding out of me with every stroke of his hand down my spine. I closed my eyes, breathing him in. You really don't have to do this. I'm not a pup. He paused. His hand rested on the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind my ear. He shifted, leaning down until his lips were brushing the shell of my ear. Safe. The word was barely a breath, a ghost of a sound. It was the second word he had spoken in 10 years. Safe. My eyes snapped open. I pulled back to look at him, shocked. His face was stoic, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were soft, molten gold in the dim light. He wasn't promising to fight the storm. He was promising to be the shelter. You spoke, I whispered. He didn't reply. He just pulled my head back down to his chest and resumed stroking my hair, his heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my cheek. And for the first time in my life, amidst the thunder and the fear of being sold, I actually believed him. Chapter 6. Office Distractions. The next morning, the tender, protective storm shield was gone. In his place was CEO Thane. He was in his office, sitting behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single redwood tree, surrounded by monitors and stacks of paperwork. He was wearing reading glasses. Reading glasses. The sight of the scarred, terrifying Alpha wearing delicate wire-rimmed frames did things to me that I wasn't ready to admit. I stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. I'm bored. He didn't look up. He pointed a finger toward the library down the hall. Read all those, I countered, walking into the room. I want to go for a run. He shook his head without lifting his eyes from a contract. No. Why? Because I might run away? I scoffed, flopping onto the leather sofa in the corner of his office. I don't even know where we are. We drove past a sign that said, now leaving civilization. I'm not running. I just need to stretch. He ignored me. He typed something on his keyboard, frowned, and highlighted a paragraph. I huffed loudly. I kicked my legs up in the air. I sighed with the dramatic flair of a Victorian widow. Nothing. He was impenetrable. Fine, I muttered. If you won't play with me, I'll play with you. I rolled off the sofa and crawled across the plush rug. He was on a video call now. I could see the little green light on his webcam. He had a headset in one ear, listening intently to someone drone on about supply chains. He couldn't react. He couldn't speak. He had to maintain his silent king persona. Perfect. I crawled under the massive opening of his desk. It was dark and smelled like leather and shoe polish. His legs were spread wide, feet planted firmly on the floor. I sat there for a moment, just breathing near him. He tensed. He knew I was there. I saw his hand on the mouse freeze. I reached out and untied his left shoelace. Above me, I heard a sharp intake of breath, but he kept his voice even, presumably nodding at the camera. I untied the right one. Then, feeling bold, I retied them together. He shifted his legs, realized he was hobbled, and went perfectly still. I stifled a giggle with my hand. This was too easy. I needed to up the stakes. I placed my hands on his knees. They were rock hard. I slowly, agonizingly slowly, ran my hands up his thighs. The muscles under his dress slacks jumped and twitched under my touch. Above the desk, I heard a pen snap. So, regarding the northern border, a tinny voice said through the headset speaker. I leaned forward and pressed a soft, open-mouthed kiss to the inside of his knee, right through the fabric. Thane let out a sound that was half cough, half growl. He slammed his hand down on the desk, muting his microphone instantly. He looked down between his legs, his face appearing in the gap of the desk. He wasn't amused. He looked like he was about to murder someone or ravish them. "Hi," I whispered, waving 2 fingers at him from the darkness of his desk. "Is this a bad time?" Chapter 7. The Green-Eyed Monster. The video call ended abruptly. I didn't see him disconnect it, but the screen went black a split second before strong hands gripped my waist and hauled me out from under the desk, like I was a wayward puppy. Thane pulled me up, spinning his chair so I landed straddling his lap. He wasn't smiling. His glasses were crooked. His hair was messy from where he'd run his hands through it in frustration, and his breathing was heavy. "Hi," I breathed, smoothing his collar. "Did you finish your meeting?" He narrowed his eyes, gripping my hips tight enough to leave bruises. The good kind. He opened his mouth, likely to silently reprimand me, but a sharp knock at the door cut the tension like a guillotine. Thane froze. His posture shifted instantly from exasperated lover to terrifying alpha. He lifted me off his lap and set me on the edge of the desk, buttoning his jacket with a single sharp movement. He pointed at me. "Stay." The door opened. A young man walked in, a beta, judging by the lack of overwhelming dominance in his aura. He was carrying a stack of files that looked heavy enough to crush a small car. He was cute, in a boy-next-door kind of way, with floppy hair and a nervous smile. "Alpha," the beta said, bowing his head slightly. "The contracts for the Southern Territory expansion. I need your signature on—" He stopped. He looked up and saw me. Me, sitting on the Alpha's desk, wearing nothing but the Alpha's shirt with my legs swinging freely. The beta's eyes went wide. His cheeks flushed a bright cherry red. He blinked, clearly unsure where to look, and instinctively offered a polite, nervous smile. "Oh, hello, Luna." I smiled back, happy to see a face that wasn't scowling. "Hi, I'm Elara. You have nice—" growl. The sound didn't come from a throat. It came from the depths of a cavern. It started low, vibrating through the floorboards, and escalated into a snarl that rattled the window panes. The beta dropped the files. Papers scattered everywhere. He turned pale, his eyes darting to Thane. Thane had stepped in front of me, blocking the beta's view completely. His shoulders were hunched, his fists clenched at his sides, and a sound was tearing out of his chest that was pure, unfiltered animal aggression. He wasn't looking at the papers. He was looking at the beta like he was about to rip his throat out for the crime of breathing the same air as me. "Get out," I whispered, eyes widening. The beta didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, and fled the room, leaving the door wide open. I looked at Thane's back. "Seriously? The poor guy just said hello. You're going to give him a heart attack." Thane turned on his heel. The fury in his eyes hadn't faded. It had shifted. It was focused on me now. He stalked forward, kicking the scattered papers out of his way. "You are ridiculous," I scoffed, though my heart rate picked up. He was just being polite. You can't just growl at every male who looks at me. It's possessive. It's caveman behavior. He cut me off by crashing his mouth onto mine. It wasn't a sweet kiss. It was a claiming. He devoured me, his tongue sweeping into my mouth with a hunger that made my toes curl. He tasted like coffee and jealousy. He pressed me back against the polished wood of the desk, his body a heavy weight pinning me down, scrubbing the beta's attention off my skin with his touch. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against mine, his chest heaving. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The message was loud and clear. Look at me. Only me. Chapter 8. The Setup. By the next afternoon, my ego was inflated to dangerous proportions. I had the silent Alpha wrapped around my little finger. I was sure of it. The man who terrified the entire region was currently letting me use his expensive imported conditioner to shave my legs. I had pushed his buttons, invaded his workspace, and stolen his clothes, and all I had gotten in return was worship. I felt invincible. I felt like the queen of the castle. And a bored queen is a dangerous thing. Thane had been gone for hours. He was in the war room, the grand conference hall in the West Wing, meeting with the Council of Elders. Apparently, it was a very serious, very boring quarterly review. I had been told by 3 separate guards to stay away. The elders are traditionalists, the head of security had warned me, looking nervous. They don't approve of interruptions. Naturally, I took that as a challenge. I was in the kitchen, humming to myself as I arranged a tray. I wasn't making sandwiches, I was making a statement. I placed a single perfect red apple on a silver platter. It was ridiculous. It was symbolic. It was entirely unnecessary. He needs a break, I told the horrified chef. All work and no play makes Thane a dull boy. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. I was wearing a silk slip dress that I had found in the back of the closet, likely a gift from some diplomat that had never been worn. It was midnight blue, clung to every curve, and left absolutely nothing to the imagination. I looked fierce. I looked expensive. I marched down the hallway, the silver tray balanced on one hand. The guards posted outside the double doors of the war room straightened up as I approached. They crossed their spears. Well, not spears, but high-tech stun batons, blocking my path. "Luna," one of them said, his voice tight. "We have strict orders. No entry. The elders are discussing pack law." I didn't stop walking. I just raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to stop me, Steve? Do you want me to tell Thane that you wouldn't let his mate bring him a snack?" Steve hesitated. He remembered the growl from yesterday. Everyone had heard about the growl. He looked at his partner, swallowed hard, and stepped aside. "Good choice," I winked. I stood before the heavy oak doors. I could hear voices inside. Gravelly, ancient, monotonous voices droning on about territory lines and treaties. It sounded suffocating. It sounded like a room that desperately needed a little chaos. I wasn't afraid. Why should I be? I was the woman who had made the Silent King speak. These old wolves were just paper tigers. I adjusted my dress, fixed a bright, mischievous smile on my face, and prepared to make an entrance. I didn't knock. I placed my hand on the handle, turned it, and shoved the heavy door open with my hip. Chapter 9. The Disrespect. Climax Part 1. The room smelled like dust, old leather, and judgment. It was a long, narrow hall with a massive stone table running down the center. Sitting around it were 12 men who looked like they had been carved out of granite during the Jurassic period. They were gray-haired, stern-faced, and radiated an aura of absolute, rigid authority. And at the head of the table sat Thane. He looked different here. In our bedroom, he was intense but warm. Here, he was cold. He sat on a high-backed chair that looked suspiciously like a throne, his face a mask of terrifying neutrality. He was listening to a withered old man speak, his fingers steeped together. When the door banged open, the silence that fell was instant and absolute. 13 pairs of eyes snapped to me. The elders looked shocked, bordering on scandalized. Thane looked up, his eyes widening imperceptibly. "Hi, boys," I announced, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Don't get up." I didn't wait for permission. I strutted down the length of the room, my heels clicking loudly on the stone floor. The sound was like gunshots in a library. I could feel the disapproval rolling off the elders in waves, but I ignored it. I was focused on Thane. He watched me approach, his expression unreadable. He didn't motion for me to leave, but he didn't welcome me either. He just went still, like a statue waiting to see if the bird landing on it was going to sing or crap on his head. I reached the head of the table. I set the silver tray down with a clatter, right on top of a map of the territory. "You've been in here for 4 hours," I said, leaning my hip against the edge of the table. "I got lonely." One of the elders, a man with a beard so long it touched the table, slammed his hand down. "This is an outrage. Alpha, remove this. Female. This is a sacred council. Thane's gaze snapped to the elder, sharp as a knife, but he didn't move. I rolled my eyes. Relax, Gandalf. I'm just checking on him. I turned my back on the sputtering elder and looked at Thane. He was looking at me with that intense, dark stare. I felt a surge of reckless playfulness. I wanted to break that stone mask. I wanted to see the man who cuddled me in his sleep. I hopped up. I didn't sit in a chair. I hopped up and sat directly on the edge of his desk, or rather, the head of the table, right in front of him. My movement knocked a stack of ancient, leather-bound treaties onto the floor with a loud thump. The room gasped, collectively. It was the sound of 12 people having a simultaneous stroke. I ignored them. I leaned forward, invading Thane's personal space, forcing his knees to part to accommodate my legs. I reached out and patted his cheek, then ruffled his dark hair, messing up the perfect styling. You look so serious, I cooed, smiling sweetly. All frowns and growls. Relax, big guy. Who's a good boy? I said it. I actually said it. Who's a good boy? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was dead. It was the silence of a bomb counting down to 0. The air pressure dropped so fast my ears popped. The elder with the beard looked like he was about to faint. She just... Thane slowly, agonizingly slowly, stood up. He rose to his full height, towering over me where I sat on the table. His shadow fell over me, blocking out the light from the chandeliers. His scent spiked, not with anger, but with something darker, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous. His eyes were pitch black, no gold, just the abyss. Oh, I whispered, the realization finally hitting me that I might have just poked the dragon one too many times. Oops. Chapter 10. The Reaction. I braced myself for the explosion. I expected him to roar. I expected him to grab me by the throat and throw me out of the room. I expected the elders to call for my head on a pike. This is unacceptable! The bearded elder, let's call him Elder Sourface, sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Alpha, this female has desecrated the council table. She has mocked you. She must be punished immediately. Thane didn't look at him. He didn't look at any of them. His gaze was locked on me, heavy and suffocating, like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The blackness in his eyes swirled, swallowing the gold irises completely. The air around him crackled with so much raw power that the hairs on my arms stood up. Slowly, Thane raised one hand. He didn't make a fist. He simply pointed a single finger toward the heavy double doors. But Alpha, another elder started. Thane turned his head. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He just looked at the man with that hollow, dead-eyed stare that promised absolute destruction. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second. The message was clear. Leave. Now. The scraping of chairs against the stone floor was deafening. The elders, for all their talk of tradition and dignity, scrambled like scared rabbits. They grabbed their papers, tripping over their robes in their haste to get away from the predator who had just woken up. Elder Sourface was the last to go, shooting me a look of pure venom before the heavy doors slammed shut with a boom that echoed like a gunshot. And then, there were two. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick. It was charged. It tasted like ozone and impending trouble. I sat there on the table, my legs dangling, suddenly feeling very small and very exposed in my silk dress. So, I said, my voice sounding brave but thin. Meeting adjourned? Thane turned back to me. He took a step forward. Then another. He moved with a prowling grace that was terrifying to behold. He stopped right between my spread knees, his thighs brushing against mine. He placed his massive hands on the table on either side of my hips, trapping me in a cage of muscle and heat. He leaned down until his nose was brushing mine. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace fueled by 10 years of repression and one moment of absolute bratty disrespect. You like to play games, Elara, he rumbled. I gasped. It was the longest string of words he had ever spoken. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding against steel, unused and deep enough to vibrate through the soles of my feet. I was just bringing a snack, I stammered, my bravado slipping. His eyes dropped to my lips, then lower, to where the silk dress clung to my chest. You are the snack, he growled. Then, without breaking eye contact, he took one arm and swept it across the table. The map, the remaining books, the priceless antique inkwell, everything went flying, crashing onto the stone floor with a destructive clatter. He didn't care. He didn't even blink. He cleared the space for one thing only: me. You called me a boy, he whispered, his lips grazing my ear, sending shivers cascading down my spine. You patted my head. He gripped my waist, his fingers digging in possessively, lifting me slightly to pull me flush against his hard body. The friction was electric. I am not a boy, Elara, he said, pulling back to look me in the eye, the fire in his gaze scorching me. But I will show you exactly what kind of man I am. Chapter 11. The Claiming. He didn't give me time to process the threat, or the promise. His mouth crashed onto mine, devouring me with a hunger that bordered on madness. This wasn't the tentative, careful affection of the morning. This was primal. This was the Wolf King asserting his dominance over the only creature in the world brave enough or stupid enough to challenge him. I wrapped my arms around his neck, tangling my fingers in his dark hair, pulling him closer. I didn't shrink away. I met his fire with my own. If he was going to burn, I was going to burn with him. He lifted me easily, moving me further onto the center of the massive stone table. The cold stone should have been uncomfortable against my back, but I couldn't feel it. I could only feel him. His hands were everywhere, roaming over my curves, claiming every inch of skin as his territory. Mine, he growled against my throat, the vibration of the word traveling straight to my heart. You are mine to tease, mine to touch, mine to anger. Say it again, I demanded, breathless, arching into his touch. Use your words, Thane. He groaned, a sound of pure frustration and desire. You are a brat, a beautiful, infuriating trouble. He kissed his way down my jaw, his stubble grazing my sensitive skin, sending sparks of pleasure through my nerves. He stopped at the junction where my neck met my shoulder. The mating spot. The one place that would bind us forever. My wolf howled in my chest, clawing at the surface, desperate for him to seal it. I had spent days fighting him, mocking him, trying to keep my walls up. But in this moment, with his heavy body pressing me into the table and his scent filling my lungs, the walls crumbled. I didn't want to be independent right now. I wanted to be his. Thane paused, his breath hot against my skin. He was giving me a choice. Even now, in the heat of the moment, the silent alpha was asking for permission. Do it, I whispered, tilting my head to the side, baring my throat to him. Claim me, Thane. He didn't hesitate. His canines grazed my skin, sharp and dangerous, before he sank them in. The pain was sharp, sudden, and fleeting, instantly replaced by a flood of euphoria so intense I saw stars. It was like a dam breaking. A rush of emotions that weren't mine flooded into my mind. Loneliness, a decade of cold silence, a crushing sense of duty, and then overwhelming, blinding relief. Her. Finally. Her. I gasped, clutching his shoulders as the bond snapped into place, knitting our souls together with invisible, unbreakable threads. I could feel him in my head. I could feel his adoration, his possessiveness, his absolute devotion. He pulled back, licking the mark on my neck to soothe it, his eyes glowing a brilliant, solid gold. The darkness was gone. Elara, he murmured, resting his forehead against mine, his voice thick with emotion. My mate, my queen. I ran my thumb over his lips, tracing the shape of the mouth that had finally spoken for me. I guess this means I can't return you to the store, I joked weakly, a tear slipping down my cheek. He chuckled, a rusty, low sound that I instantly wanted to hear for the rest of my life. No returns, he promised. You're stuck with me. Chapter 12. The vow explained. The stone table was, admittedly, not the most comfortable place for a post-mating cuddle, but neither of us seemed willing to move. We were lying in a tangle of limbs and discarded silk. Thane's jacket draped over us like a makeshift blanket. The storm outside the castle had passed, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, but the silence between us felt different now. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge. I traced the white scar that cut through his eyebrow. So, I whispered, breaking the quiet, you can talk. You have a voice, and a very bossy one at that. Thane captured my hand and kissed my knuckles. I do. Why didn't you? I asked, turning to look at him. 10 years, Thane. The rumors, they said you were cursed. They said you lost your mind. His expression sobered. He sat up slightly, pulling me up with him so I was resting against his chest. He took a deep breath, as if testing the air, getting used to the sensation of speaking freely. It was a plague, he said softly. 10 years ago, just after I took the Alpha title, a sickness swept through the pack. It was killing the pups first. The healers couldn't stop it. The magic failed. I listened, stunned. I remembered hearing about a sickness in the north, but no one knew the details. I went to the Moonstone Shrine, he continued, his voice steady but pained. I begged the goddess to spare them. I offered her anything, my life, my strength. She didn't want my life. She wanted my sacrifice. Your voice? I guessed. He nodded. A vow of silence. I had to give up my ability to command, to connect, to speak, until I found the one person who could hear me without words, the one who could understand the wolf beneath the man. He looked down at me, his eyes tender. The pact was simple. Silence until the true mate arrived. If I spoke a single word before I claimed you, the sickness would return. My heart squeezed. He hadn't been being a jerk. He hadn't been trying to intimidate me. He had been protecting his pack, carrying the weight of their lives in his throat for a decade. He had endured the rumors, the fear, and the isolation, all to keep his people safe. And I came in here, I said, feeling a flush of shame, and called you a mute brute and poked you in the chest. Thane smirked, the expression lightening his scarred face. You did. You were magnificent. Everyone else tiptoes around me, terrified of the monster. You walked in and treated me like a man. Like a stubborn man, I corrected. Like a man worth fighting with, he amended. When you sat on this table today, when you challenged me, I knew. The bond was already there, but that fire, that was what broke the seal. The goddess accepted the trade. He leaned in and kissed me softly. You gave me my voice back, Elara. I smiled, leaning into him. Well, don't use it all up at once. I still like the growling. He laughed again, but the moment was cut short by a tentative knock at the heavy doors. Thane stiffened, his arm tightening around me instinctively. The bubble of our privacy was about to burst. We had scared off the council, likely traumatized a beta, and destroyed a historic table. The pack was probably in a panic, wondering if their alpha had finally snapped and eaten the new girl. We have to go out there, I whispered. I know, Thane said. He stood up, lifting me with him and set me on my feet. He adjusted my dress, smoothing the silk with surprising care, then buttoned his own shirt. He offered me his arm. It was a courtly, old-fashioned gesture that fit him perfectly. They are expecting the Silent King, he said, his voice dropping to that command tone that made my knees weak. Let's go introduce them to the loudest queen. I took his arm, chin held high. Ready when you are, Alpha. He led me to the doors. He didn't hesitate. He threw them open, revealing a hallway packed with anxious wolves, guards, staff, and the returning elders. Thane stepped into the hallway, pulling me to his side. The crowd gasped, stepping back. They looked at him, then at the mark on my neck. Thane took a deep breath, scanning the faces of his people. He opened his mouth, and for the first time in 10 years, the Mountain Ridge Pack heard their alpha's command. "Bow!" he roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the manor. "To your Luna." Chapter 13, The Public Debut. The command hit the hallway like a physical shockwave. Bow. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a compulsion woven into the very fabric of his alpha tone. For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. The guards, the maids, and the gathered elders stared at Thane as if he had just sprouted a second head. They had spent 10 years interpreting his hand signals, his glares, and the tilt of his head. They had forgotten what he sounded like. They had forgotten that before he was the silent alpha, he was the loudest, most dominant voice in the North. Then, gravity took over. One by one, knees hit the floor. It started with the guards, trained to obey instinct, and rippled outward like a wave until the entire hallway was a sea of bowed heads. Even the elders, stiff with age and pride, lowered themselves. They weren't bowing out of politeness. They were bowing because their alpha's voice had triggered a primal instinct they couldn't fight. I stood there, clutching Thane's arm, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had expected fear. I had expected confusion. I hadn't expected this. Thane didn't look at them. He looked at me. His golden eyes were warm, anchoring me in the chaos. He squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance that I wasn't alone in the spotlight. "Rise," Thane said. The word was softer this time, but it still carried that gravelly, unused texture that sent shivers down my spine. The pack scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide, darting between Thane and the fresh mating mark on my neck. The whispers started instantly, a low buzz of shock and awe. "He speaks," someone whispered. "The curse is broken," another murmured. "Broken?" A sharp, craggy voice cut through the whispers. It was Elder Marcus, the sour-faced man with the beard who had nearly had a stroke in the conference room. He stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief and lingering indignation. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You broke his vow?" Marcus demanded, looking at me like I was a virus. This outsider? This girl who was purchased like cattle? She is the reason you speak, Alpha? She is not of royal blood. She is a debt payment." The hallway went deadly silent again. Thane stiffened beside me. I felt the growl building in his chest, a deep rumble that vibrated through his arm into mine. He took a step forward, his shadow lengthening over the elder, ready to tear him apart verbally or physically for the insult. But I tightened my grip on his arm, stopping him. "No," I said clearly. "Let me." Thane paused. He looked down at me, the protective fire in his eyes warring with curiosity. He nodded once, stepping back just an inch to give me the floor. I released his arm and took a step toward Elder Marcus. I didn't cower. I didn't flinch. I smoothed the silk of my dress and looked him dead in the eye. "You're right, Marcus," I said, my voice ringing out with a confidence I had forged in the fires of being the underdog my whole life. I was purchased. My father sold me to settle a score. I came here with a price tag on my head. I paused, letting the words sink in. I saw Marcus smirk, thinking he had won. "But here is the difference between cattle and a queen," I continued, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "Cattle get slaughtered. I got claimed." I tapped the mark on my neck. "Your Alpha didn't break his vow for a bloodline. He didn't break it for a treaty. He broke it because for 10 years he was waiting for someone who wasn't afraid of him." And looking around this room, I scanned the faces of the terrified elders. It seems I'm the only one who fits that description. I turned back to Marcus, tilting my head. "So, you can call me a debt payment if you want. But since I'm the one holding the leash of the monster you're all so afraid of, I suggest you show a little respect. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Thane, waiting for the Alpha to reprimand me for my insolence. Thane didn't reprimand me. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a rich, booming sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled me flush against his side. "You heard her," Thane told the room, his voice lacing with pride. "She is not just my mate. She is the keeper of my voice. Disrespect her and you challenge me." He looked down at me, his eyes shining. "Come, Luna. I believe we have a home to run." Chapter 14. Domestic Power. The first week of our rule was less about governing a kingdom and more about me trying to figure out how to live with a man who was essentially a clingy, possessive giant with a newfound love for conversation. Thane was making up for 10 years of silence with a vengeance. He talked constantly. He narrated his paperwork. He whispered obscene things in my ear during breakfast. He debated the merits of different coffee blends with the passion of a philosopher. But mostly, he just wanted to be near me. I was currently in the kitchen, attempting to perform a domestic miracle, making dinner. The pack had a full staff of world-class chefs, all of whom were currently huddled in the pantry, terrified because the Luna had insisted on cooking and had banished them from their own domain. "I can do this," I muttered, staring at the skillet. "It's just eggs. Eggs are easy. Birds lay them. How hard can they be to cook?" I cracked an egg. Shell went everywhere. I cursed. "You missed a spot," a deep voice rumbled right next to my ear. I jumped, nearly dropping the spatula. Thane had materialized behind me, silent as a ghost despite his size. He wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder, effectively trapping me against the counter. "You are hovering," I accused, trying to fish a piece of shell out of the pan. "I am observing," he corrected, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot just below my ear. "It is a critical alpha duty, ensuring the safety of the—" "What is that? An omelet?" "It's a scramble," I lied. "It's a rustic, deconstructed scramble." "It looks like charcoal," he noted helpfully. "It's caramelized." I turned in his arms, pointing the spatula at his chest. "If you're going to critique the chef, you can get out of my kitchen, Thane." He smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that made his scar crinkle. He looked younger now. The weight that had been on his shoulders the night I arrived seemed to have evaporated. "I wouldn't dream of leaving," he murmured. "I like the view." He leaned down and kissed me, tasting of coffee and devotion. I melted into him, forgetting about the eggs, forgetting about the staff hiding in the pantry. Being with him felt so easy, so natural, that it scared me sometimes. "Something is burning," he whispered against my lips. "It's just our passion," I joked breathlessly. "No," he pulled back, sniffing the air. "It is definitely the eggs." I spun around. The pan was smoking. The rustic scramble was now a blackened, unrecognizable puck of organic matter. "Oh no," I groaned, turning off the stove. "I ruined it. I can't believe it. I wanted to make you something nice just to show you I'm not totally useless around here, and I made toxic waste." Thane reached past me. He didn't throw it away. He grabbed a fork, scraped a piece of the black substance off the pan and popped it into his mouth. My eyes widened. "Thane, don't. You'll die." He chewed. His face remained perfectly stoic. He swallowed. "Delicious." He lied. He didn't even flinch. Crunchy, smoky, an acquired taste. I stared at him, my heart doing a traitorous little flip. "You are a terrible liar." "I am a devoted mate," he corrected, taking another bite of the charcoal. "And if my queen cooks poison, I will ask for seconds." I laughed, swatting his arm. "Stop eating that. You're the Alpha King. Act like it." He set the fork down and pulled me back into his arms, his expression turning serious. "I am acting like it. An alpha protects his pack. And right now, I am protecting your feelings." I rested my head against his chest. listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You know," I whispered, "when my father sold me, I thought my life was over. I thought I was just a transaction." Thane went still. The playful mood vanished instantly. "Wait here," he commanded. He released me and walked out of the kitchen. He returned 30 seconds later holding a piece of paper. It was thick, expensive parchment. The bill of sale. The contract my father had signed. Thane held it up. "This?" I nodded, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. Thane walked over to the stove. He turned the gas burner back on. With a calm, deliberate motion, he held the corner of the contract to the flame. We watched in silence as the paper curled and blackened, the words of my sale turning to ash and floating up into the extractor fan. "There is no transaction," Thane said, dropping the last burning corner into the sink. He turned to me, his eyes fierce. "You were never sold, Elara. You were just taking the long way home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something else. It wasn't paper. It was a small velvet box. "However," he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, "I would like to make a new contract, one that lasts a little longer than a debt payment." He got down on one knee on the kitchen floor, amidst the smoke and the smell of burnt eggs. "Elara," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that looked like it was crafted from starlight and diamonds. "Will you make me the happiest, loudest man on earth?" Chapter 15. Epilogue. "Yes," I choked out, the word barely audible over the hum of the extractor fan desperately trying to clear the smoke. "Yes, you absolute lunatic. Yes." Silas didn't wait. He surged up from the floor, sliding the ring onto my finger with a practiced ease before sweeping me into a crushing embrace. He kissed me like he was breathing me in, like I was the oxygen he had denied himself for a decade. We stood there in the center of the ruined kitchen, surrounded by the smell of burnt eggs and the ghost of a destroyed contract, and I knew with terrifying certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That was 5 years ago. You'd think after 5 years, the novelty of the silent king finding his voice would have worn off, but even now as I stood on the balcony of the master suite, looking out over the endless green expanse of the mountain ridge territory, I could still hear the whispers. They called us the Golden Era. They told stories about how the fierce outsider had tamed the beast, how she had broken the curse with nothing but sass and a refusal to shut up. "You are thinking too loud," a deep, rumbling voice murmured against my ear. I didn't flinch. I leaned back, letting the solid wall of muscle that was my mate support my weight. Silas wrapped his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder, his beard scratching lightly against the sensitive skin of my neck. "I'm just admiring the view," I said, covering his hands with mine. The diamond on my finger caught the light of the setting sun, fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. "And thinking about how terrified those new recruits looked today when you yelled at them during training." Silas chuckled, the sound vibrating through his chest and into my back. They were slacking. A quiet alpha is a dangerous alpha, but a loud alpha gets results. "You love it," I teased, turning in his arms to face him. He was older now. The silver in his beard was more pronounced and the lines around his eyes were deeper, but he was still the most devastatingly handsome creature I had ever seen. The scar on his brow was still there, a reminder of the pain he had carried, but his eyes were no longer dark abysses. They were bright, warm, and currently looking at me with an intensity that made my knees weak, even after all this time. "I love you," he corrected, his voice dropping to that husky timbre that was reserved solely for me. "I tolerate the rest of them, but I love you." He ran a thumb over my lower lip, his gaze dropping to my mouth. "Do you remember the night you arrived? You stood in this room and insulted my furniture?" "Your furniture was ugly," I defended, grinning, "and you were lurking in the shadows like a gargoyle." "I was captivated," he admitted softly. "I had spent 10 years in silence, Zara, 10 years of cold. And then you walked in, smelling like rain and defiance, and I wanted to burn the world down just to keep you warm." My heart squeezed. It always did when he talked about the time before. The sacrifice he had made for his pack, the years of isolation, was a weight he still carried, but he didn't carry it alone anymore. "I'm glad you didn't burn the world down," I whispered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "I'm quite fond of the world, especially the parts of it that belong to us." Silas captured my hand, pressing a kiss to my palm. "Everything I have is yours. My pack, my voice, my soul." He pulled me closer, the playful banter fading into the simmering heat that was the constant undercurrent of our marriage. We weren't just rulers, we were anchors for each other. He was the mountain, unmovable and strong, and I was the storm that kept the air fresh and the lightning striking. "Are you happy, Silas?" I asked, searching his gold eyes. "Truly?" He didn't answer with words immediately. He looked out over the forest, the territory that flourished under our joint rule, and then back at me. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, sharing his breath, his scent, his peace. "They called me the Silent King," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For a decade, I thought silence was my penance. I thought I had lost the ability to connect." He kissed me then, slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of forever. When he pulled back, his smile was the only sunrise I would ever need. "But I was never truly silent, Zara," he murmured against my lips. "I was just saving my words for the only woman who would ever matter enough to hear them."